The various folks have gone from sentient, self-aware machines to, hey, this thing can do this job better than you.
The same level of skepticism I would have when a conspiracy theorist locked in their bedroom with a big ball of yarn says, look, I figured it out.
Do it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast.
All right, I'm here today with Chris Penn. Chris, how are you, sir?
I am well. How about yourself?
I am also well. I think just before we started, we both agreed we were not going to share all of our grievances. So in that case, life can't be better.
Exactly. Things are great.
Awesome. So before we get too far down any rabbit holes, which is extremely likely to happen, give everybody a 2-minute. Who are you? How did you get here? What are you selling? And then that way everybody can fast forward 2 minutes forward, skip the sales pitch, and then we can get into the good stuff. But
Sure. My name is Christopher Penn. I'm the co-founder and chief data scientist of TrustInsights.ai. We are a management consulting firm. Been around since 2018. We help companies figure out what to do with their data, their analytics, and their AI. I got here via a very long, circuitous journey. My background originally was in IT, and then in the early 2000s, I worked at a financial services startup, and IT became marketing technology. I started picking up analytics as a profession in 2005 when Google bought this company called Urchin and then renamed it Google Analytics. And then in the 2010s, I worked. I moved and pivoted to working at a PR agency of all places after a stint at an email marketing company. And it was in 2012 when I first started seeing that a lot of the problems I needed to solve in analytics could not be solved with traditional math. You had to use what was then really starting to be known as machine learning. Programming languages like Python and R. So 2012, 2013 is when I first really started digging into machine learning, trying to do things like uplift modeling to say like, hey, you've got all this other stuff going on, emails going out and paper, and print ads and bus wraps and stuff. And all of that has an influence on your marketing. So how do you know if something worked when you have all this other noise? And so machine learning techniques can figure that out. And then in 2021, I started looking, I saw the first usable example of a transformers model from a company called Eleuthera AI. They released a model called GPT-J6B, a 6 billion parameter model that could generate coherent text. It wasn't intelligent, and it could only do like 500 words at a time, and it was pretty bad. But there was that point where I'm like, this generative AI stuff, which by the way had been around for 4 years at that point, but all in labs because it was invented in 2017. But it was in 2021 when I went, this is going to be a thing. If this tool can write, that's going to be a thing. And then, of course, November 2022 rolls around. OpenAI releases GPT 3.5, their flagship model at the time, and the web utility called ChatGPT. And then suddenly, everyone in the world is an AI expert. and that's how, and here we are today, right? Exactly. So that's sort of the long, circuitous path I've taken to get here.
Well, you know what? I think most people that get anywhere can only do it with a long, circuitous path. So you're probably not alone in that journey, as it were. It's natural to me to jump right from there into the AI world, which seems to be a topic we keep getting to. Where are we in AI? Like if we're plotting vertical lines on a timeline, are we right at the very beginning of something that's really long? Are we somewhat in the middle? Where are we in the long circuitous journey to AI?
So the technologies in artificial intelligence as a field overall have existed for 70 years. The technologies for generative AI have existed for about 7 years. And we are now at a point where we have enough compute power and enough widespread distribution, particularly of models that are open and available to everyone, that if I had to put it in layman's terms, I'd say we're probably at the bottom of either the bottom of the first or top of the second inning when it comes to the use of AI, particularly generative AI, and how people are using these tools. We are still overall dramatically underusing the power of these tools. And research in the field is still enormously underway to figure out what these things are capable of. So, for example, the Transformers model, which underpins the technology behind a chat GPT, takes pieces of information in called tokens and predicts pieces of information out. That's fundamentally what it does. What's special about it is that it can remember everything that's been given, and then as it creates new things, it relies on what's happened in the past to predict what's happening going forward. That's why it can write a blog post for you, because it has this massive library of training data, but it can take into account and remember the conversation you've had to spit things forward. Well, what can be tokenized is not just words. We use it for words, right? That's, write a blog post, write an email, do these things. But anything that is tokenized can be fed into these things. So, for example, there was a lot of early research and interest in using this with DNA and RNA to predict mutations, to predict protein folding, to predict vaccine candidates, right? Think about a chat GPT, but for RNA, where you can ask it, what kind of vaccine should we make for maybe a new virus that we've never seen before? That's a pretty cool application. There are versions of these that are being used with musical notes. Predict the next note in this sequence based on everything you've seen. There are some tools. For example, one called Suno that a lot of people are aware of. There's another one called Ava and another one called Udio, where we're starting to be able to predict musical sequences that do have some logic to them. Essentially, anything that's predictable in terms of what comes next, these tools can do. And so we are still in the early days of everything. We are still figuring out how they work. We're still figuring out how to get them to do what we want them to do. And so it's difficult to forecast where this is going to go, except that we know it's not going to go away. And the reason I say that, particularly for the mainstream stuff, is that there are obviously some very big tech companies, Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, that manufacture models that you can use in a web interface. And it is entirely possible that in a year and a half, maybe OpenAI runs out of money, right? And they just close up shop. The models themselves, there are state-of-the-art models that are being given away in their entirety by companies like Meta. Meta has a model called Llama 3.1. There's a version of that is on par with what ChatGPT can do. Meta's giving this away to the world. Take it. You run it on your own hardware, your own in your own infrastructure. Meta has nothing to do with it after that. That means that generative AI capabilities and tools are now permanently a part of how we do things. Even if the big tech companies and the big brands went away, the technology is not going anywhere.
So, knowing that it's early, you mentioned that we're underusing it today. Is that because it has to be more than just we haven't figured out other things to tokenize? Is it just the general technology life cycle? Like right now we're in early adopter mode, or is there something special about the way AI is being adopted?
It's a few things. Number one, models themselves keep getting longer and longer short-term memories. So there's two versions of memory these things have. One is their long-term memory, which is their training library. This is the data that they were taught on how to perform their tasks, and that keeps getting bigger and bigger. For example, Meta's Llama model had 15 trillion tokens in its training library, which is a massive amount of data. To put that in context, I have here William Shakespeare's complete plays. This is 38 plays. This is 800,000 words, right? The training data for today's models is approximately a bookshelf of these that goes around the equator of the planet twice. That's how much just raw text a lot of these things are trained on. But that's a long-term memory. The short-term memory is how much it can remember inside of a conversation. So ChatGPT can hold 128,000 tokens in its memory. It works at about 85, 90,000 words, right? That's a business book. You could put a mid-sized business book in as a prompt, and it would be able to process it. Anthropic's Claude has 200,000 tokens, so about 140, 150,000 words. Google's Gemini has 2 million tokens. So that is 2 of Shakespeare as a prompt. Right? If you think about that, that's crazy town to be able to do that. And that means that they can process enormous amounts of data. For example, I took all of the bylaws and ordinances of the city I live in, which is about 400 pages of text. It's really boring text. And I put it all into Gemini, and I said, I want you to, understand my city's bylaws. And then I said, pretend I'm an unethical mayor. These are the city's bylaws. Maybe I'm a racist mayor. What of these ordinances could I weaponize against marginalized communities? And it gave me a long list of that. It said, this one, here's how it could be misused. And then I said, okay, great. What I want to do now is come up with a plan of action that I can hand to my city selectmen and say, I would like these laws amended to patch these holes so that an unethical mayor couldn't weaponize them against certain parts of the city. So that's an example of using a tool. It's way beyond write me a blog post, right? It's now use the huge memory of these tools to do this. When I think of, for example, in the world, in all the different places people live, the ability for an average citizen to take a piece of legislation that's proposed and say, hey, what are the unintended consequences of this proposed legislation? How could it be misused? What are we not seeing? What are the hidden motivations of the person who introduced this legislation? Suddenly, instead of government being a very opaque thing, it could be a very transparent thing with these tools to say, like, yeah, these are the issues with this. And I think optimistically, it could be used to craft better societies.
That seems like a lot.
It does seem like a lot, but here's the thing. It doesn't take, it's not something everyone has to do. You need one person in a jurisdiction to say, hey, you know what? I want to use generative AI to analyze this. And then that person, as long as they're connected with others, can communicate, hey, I found these things that are concerning to me. Maybe we should not do this, or maybe we should do this a different way. But in general, that's what I mean when I say we're dramatically underusing these tools, because we have not figured out as people how to point them at a bunch of different tasks and see what's possible with analyzing massive amounts of unstructured data. I'll give you another example. I did a competitive analysis for a pharmaceutical company looking at one of their competitors. I took that competitor's job openings, all 1,900 of them, and I put them into a language model and said, tell me this company's 12 to 18-month strategy based on the 1,900 things they're hiring for today, because it's going to take them half a year to a year to get those people up to speed. But once they are, you never hire full-time employees just for something unimportant. You always hire for the critically important things. Otherwise, use agencies or contractors or something else. But full-time hires are expensive, and they're a big commitment. And it came up, the model came up with a 20-page competitive analysis based on what this company was hiring for and what they wrote in the job descriptions. So they figured maybe not that many people would read. These tools can put together the pieces, kind of like, that the conspiracy theorists with the strings and the yarn all over the bulletin board with all the clippings. They can do that kind of analysis. And that's the kind of thing that I would like to see more people use these tools for.
I like that analogy of the conspiracy theorist with the strings and the yarn, because I've really only dabbled, but my early experience is a lot of probably the same level of skepticism I would have when a conspiracy theorist and locked in their bedroom with a big ball of yarn says, look, I figured it out. Which is to say, there's so much, it's like trust but verify that still needs to happen, which is as I think about, the first analogy used of here are all the laws that need to be changed. I mean, I would be like, here's a list of laws that now I need to go research, and I need to actually make sure the changes that are proposing aren't crazy pants, because you end up with my early AI skepticism line that I still use is listen, we've been making hand dryers for a lot of years now with, the most advanced hand dryer technology. And 70% of the time when I put my hands into the device whose only job is to detect hands, it's like, I don't know what these are, but they're not hands. Or same thing with sinks, right? It's like the best and brightest minds in microchips have been like, hey, detect a hand. And we suck at it still, 25, 30, 40 years on. And then people send me, somehow I became a magnet, I guess. So people send me hey, ask ChatGPT how to spell strawberry. How many R's are in the word strawberry? And it's like, I can only take so much advice from something that's telling me there's 2 R's in the word strawberry. Or more recently, draw me a picture of a wine glass full to the top. And it's like, here's a wine glass full to the top. And it's clearly 50%. And I'm like, sorry, so you're the thing rewriting all the laws? Question mark. And so, like, for me, I see that as an adoption problem, is like that skepticism. Now, those things are outliers, right? In if you look at them in from a data analytics standpoint, it's like, yes, there are some things it's going to get really extremely wrong, but the bell curve is actually pretty good. The problem is, as humans, especially skeptical humans, we go, ooh, look, it gave a weird or incorrect or incomplete or something answer 0.001% of the time. But those are the things that I was asking it. Therefore, this thing is untrustworthy, let's say.
Yes. And that highlights the technical flaw in human beings. Human beings perceive things. Human beings, first of all, can't do probability to save their lives. Quite literally, to save their lives, they cannot. And as a result, they make a lot of very, very poor decisions. Here's an example. I'm going to ask you this, and don't Google it. Just give me your honest opinion.
I'm showing my hands.
What is the average misdiagnosis rate for serious disorders like cardiovascular disorders, cancer, etc., among human doctors in the USA? How often do they get it right? How often do they get it wrong?
I would guess the misdiagnosis rate has to be like low 40%, if I had to guess.
Oh, it's much lower than that, actually. It's 11%.
Okay. Oh, that seems way high for serious diseases. Like,
yeah. There was a British Medical Journal study about this. 11% is the misdiagnosis rate for serious things, with a 4.4% serious harm outcome, meaning the diagnosis basically killed somebody.
It's only 11%. Like,
on average, it's 11%.
The devil's in the details there somewhere, because there's no way that at a first pass, doctors correctly identify which cancer somebody has 9 times out of 10. That seems improbable. I mean, maybe after 6 months of eliminating stuff, I suppose, but it seems unlikely.
Here's the follow-up question: what do you think of a well-prompted AI? What do you think its average misdiagnosis rate is?
I would guess it's 80% less than the humans.
35% less. It's a 7.2% misdiagnosis rate. What
I was trying to map the Tesla autonomous driving data back to like the accidents per 100 miles against human versus automated drivers.
And so what that means is, if you were to adopt AI properly prompted for medical diagnosis, you would have 35% less misdiagnosis. Now, going back to what you were saying earlier, when someone says, if it's 0.01% wrong, it's completely untrustworthy. What that means is that mindset among human beings prohibits human beings from saying, hey, let's get 35% less suffering and less misery and less illness. Instead, what we're saying is it's not perfect, therefore let's not use it, and let's continue to accept 35% more suffering and misery and misdiagnosis with serious harms, because we're not willing to accept better. We have to. People want perfect and not better.
Yeah, well, so in my mind, it's the way that the mistakes show up. Like, it's the something happening to one person is a tragedy. Something happened to 100 million people is a statistic. So like on a per mile basis, say Teslas or autonomous driving is way safer than human drivers. At the same time, I've never mistook a semi-truck for a cloud and driven into one head on and killed myself and my family. So it's like, it's not that it's wrong, it's the way it's wrong 0.01% of the time. And even my same analogy, I expect it's going to give me a whole bunch of wrong answers when I prompt, or not the answers that I would take as the most valid ones or something when I prompt it. But I don't expect it to miscount the number of R's in the word strawberry, right? So there's like an error rate versus like an error rate that my 4-year-old child would not make. That's it's not when it's wrong, it's the way that it's wrong, typically, is what makes humans go like, hold on, which goes back to the crazy conspiracy theorist guy with the webs and the everything, is like the way data is presented, and I'll ask you if you see this as the same human flaw. The way data is presented typically can make the same data set seem crazy pants, let's say. So, for example, if I said, hey, listen, there's been a lot of bank closures. When they happen, there's runs on banks. It's not a terrible idea to keep $1,000 cash in your house just in case. It's good to have, right? Seems reasonable. You know what? It's good to keep $1,000 in cash in your house on your mattress just in case the aliens come and vaporize all the banks. The advice is the same. But the fact that the person sharing the advice was the person with the thing about the aliens vaporizing and the whatever makes you go, I'm going to slowly back away. And I go, okay, I'm going to, even if that person was right about 95 of their last 100 predictions with the web and the whatever, statistically, they're very accurate in their conspiracy theories. But then the 5% that like, it turns out aliens didn't take over the White House. Is very different than like I predict will eliminate, the $1 bill in the next 10 years. Like it's the way that things are wrong to me that throw me, that make me overlook the statistics. Like the fact that it's statistically safer to, have the autonomous car driving me, but then also it confuses a semi-truck for, a traffic sign. I'm like, I now kind of want to drive again. Because I don't want to die because my AI thought a semi-truck was a butterfly. Just like, I don't want that on my tombstone. Right? Because the epithet would be that, but then like, but, statistically, it was 99% safer than a human driver. It just, when it happens to you, it's like when you're part of the outlier, it's that same thing, right? Like, the analogy is you get emotional around the statistics. You're like, yeah, sure. I don't know how many hundreds of thousand miles I drive. Great, I'm a little bit safer. Amazing.
Sure.
Well, is that it? I guess what I'm saying is it's not the fact that it's right or wrong. It's the way the errors show up and they get magnified by, let's say, media, or like, the ultimate case that comes to mind as well was the lawyer who, cited cases that didn't exist because AI told him to cite them. And then in his defense of that, his proof was a screenshot of the AI being like, no, it's really a case. And it really wasn't. So it's like the fact that it's right a whole bunch of other times, if that guy's my attorney, I'm like, I would prefer you don't use this ever again.
Which, understandably, as you said, that is very much an emotional response to, and not, a lot of people cannot easily put statistics within an emotional construct to say like, 99.999% of the time, this thing is going to go well. 0.001% of the time, it's going to think a truck is a semi and drive into it, right?
Yeah.
That is something that emotionally people just cannot wrap their brains around, to say, okay, of the, how many hours a year, a week or an hour, a year do you spend in your car, right? And most people, it's going to be somewhere on the order of like 300 or 400. So you have to get to 100,000 hours before you find that 1 hour. Like, oh yeah, it thinks that's a cloud, right? So you have
Well,
to drive for, I don't know, 200 years before
yes.
it runs into that probability. And that's where, to your point earlier about framing, how you frame the data is what matters. To say this is reliable 99.999% of the time, it is going to do a better job than you, especially if you are below average as a driver, right?
Yes.
For
What's missing is in the counter analogy is all the people whose gravestones read they spilled coffee on themselves and looked down and swerved into an oncoming vehicle, which
exactly. Or
right.
in many cases, my parents are in their 80s. I love my parents. I think they're wonderful people. I would love to have them around for another 20 years. I don't think they should be behind a wheel in 20 years. I think a machine should be driving them because age takes its toll on your reflexes and things like that. And so your capabilities as a human decline with age. Funny enough, as time goes by, AI's capabilities increase the more mature the technology becomes and things. And so if you add a fourth nine or a fifth nine onto that decimal, now you're talking about the probability of something bad happening being well outside many human lifetimes. So from a safety perspective, yes, that one time it drove into a truck is going to happen to 1 out of 100 million people, right? Meanwhile, 10,000 people are dying a day because they're spilling coffee. I saw one person driving down the Mass Turnpike, drinking coffee, holding a paper with a snack in their hand, and steering with their knees. I'm like, you know what? Give me AI any day over that person because that person is a hazard.
I'll take a sleeping Tesla driver over that.
Exactly. I'll take a dog driving over that because the dog won't be able to reach the gas pedal. At least he'll just swerve off to the side of the road.
Yeah.
But a lot of that is the different biases that people have about the technology, and it's not an unhealthy thing because we should insist, if we are going to hand off something to a machine, we should insist that it do better than us, right? Otherwise there's no point in it. And it should do substantially better than us. So if you can go from a driver like me who is safe, 99% of the time to a machine that's safe 99.999% of the time, that's a big change.
Sure. Well, and, again, going back to the old adage of 80% of people think they're above average drivers, right? So going back to the humans are bad at probability, the likelihood that it helps you if you're in the 20% somewhere is also an outsized return against, right? Like I can see people who haven't had an accident in 20 years being like, I literally don't think I could be safer. But that person who's got duct tape holding their fender up, and it's like you maybe could be safe. Like maybe AI would help you. But I feel like it's right now it's easy from the cheap seats to take shots at the language models because of where they are. Let's talk about the other branches of AI, which really aren't getting a whole lot of attention right now.
So there's three. There's regression AI, classification AI, and generative AI. Generative AI is what everyone knows. ChatGPT, Midjourney, make me music, make me art, make me stuff. Regression AI we've had forever. This is given an outcome, what things have a relationship to that outcome. Find the relationship. So if you in marketing, we have things like attribution analysis. You have all sorts of different ways to say, I've got an outcome and I need to know of all this huge amount of data, what is that outcome, or what can I predict from this set of data? So given in marketing, given a set of search terms, can I predict when people in the next year will search for this term? And if you have enough data, the answer is yes, you can, assuming that there is any level of predictability to it. Where regression and analytics falls down, of course, is when you have things that are unpredictable. By definition, you have no training data for the model, and therefore it cannot predict anything. A really good example. Now, this episode is going to air after the U.S. presidential election.
Yes.
But every U.S. presidential election is different. Even if the candidates are the same, the electorate, the people are different. The media environment is different. How much Russian influence is different each time. And so you cannot accurately predict the outcome of a U.S. presidential election ever, period. It's just one of those things that is not predictable. And it's funny because again, this is airing after it, so hopefully things went well. But even all the polling that people do, the polling does a poor job because it's trying to predict something that cannot be predicted, and it's sampling data from bad statistical data. So, for example, a lot of polls ask likely voters. Well, by definition, that excludes unlikely voters. And if you have an unlikely election, you will have unlikely voters, and therefore your model kind of falls down. So that's one branch. The second branch is classification AI, which is here's a big pile of data, organize it. For example, and anyone who's ever worked in social media knows this. You have social media data. You have all these comments on LinkedIn or Threads or whatever, and you want to organize them. What's the sentiment, or what are the topics that people are talking about and things? And you have this massive file of data, and you have a machine organize it. And what's funny is that we think of generative AI as a separate thing, but generative AI is built out of classification and regression. If you decompose the models, they're really nothing more than those two things glued together with a bunch of very specific techniques to make the mathematics work. And those are sort of the three branches of AI right now.
And then obviously the looming future someday. Do we get to AGI? Like where do you sit on that?
Well, AGI, or artificial general intelligence, is a term that has had some moving goalposts. The various folks, particularly in Silicon Valley, have gone from a definition of sentient, self-aware machines to, hey, this thing can do this job better than you, right? They've really moved the goalposts because sentience is pretty far away from what we can technologically do today. Sentience, at least our best understanding of it, arises out of complexity, arises out of massive parallelism. If you look at the structure of the human brain or any animal brain, any living creature that you consider sentient, they have neural networks, real neural networks made of cells that are slow in computation. Like your brain operates on like a millisecond time scale, which is, in the world of circuitry, is really slow. But what makes your brain really powerful is that it is a network of 85, 90 billion neurons that are all internetworked together. And it is that complexity, that nearly infinite number of combinations of brain activations that allows consciousness to arise. Even a mouse has like 70 million neurons. It's a full order of magnitude less than a human. To replicate a mouse in today's hardware would be a data center that would consume something like 700 megawatts of power and have, I forget how, I think 70,000 or 100,000 NVIDIA H100 GPUs just to replicate the capability of a mouse brain. And a mouse can operate on cheese and chocolate, right? And this thing over here needs a nuclear reactor just to be able to turn on. So we're pretty far away from sentience. The only computational architecture right now that has any promise of achieving that level of massive parallelism is quantum computing. And it is still so unstable that it's not ready, not even ready for lab tests, much less prime time. So we are very far away from that. In terms of the revised, greatly lowered expectations version of AGI, can you have a model that is fluent and capable at any given job requiring essentially no training to begin with? We're kind of there already in many ways. Today's foundation models are so capable at most things that, given a task, they can perform that task better than the average person, because the average person, by definition, is average. They're not particularly good at it. So things like transcribe this podcast, or write a summary of this podcast. These tools can do it faster than us by orders of magnitude, and they can generally well prompt to do it better than us with very little additional preparation. They are very skillful right now in the written word, because writing is an extremely condensed data format. You can pack a lot of information into a word. They are getting more fluent in imagery. We are at a point now where today's image generation models, they are good enough to be problematic, to be like, is that machine generated? I'm not 100% sure. And you have to get out the magnifying glass and look real close. Like, does this person have the correct number of teeth? Things like that. The days of a person having like 18 fingers on one hand are largely past. They're still not fluent in things like video generation. They're still it is still blatantly obvious that something is machine generated in that domain. They're okay, but not great in audio, because audio is surprisingly complex. I will go off on a bit of a rant here.
Yes.
One thing that for sure does not work is AI detection software. AI detection software, particularly for the written word, is horrendously bad, completely unreliable. And organizations of any kind who are using it, particularly in academia, should stop using it immediately, get a refund, and never use it again. And here's why. The false positive rate for it is unacceptably high. The way I frame it is, what percentage of students or faculty members are you willing to falsely accuse and risk a lawsuit when you use these tools? They are, on average, like slightly more wrong than a coin flip. So that's how bad they are. I did some tests recently. They flagged Federalist Paper number 8 as AI written, 97% AI written, and the Declaration of Independence is 97.2% AI written, which clearly indicates these tools just have no fluency. And I did some additional tests. I took a 1924 op-ed from the New York Times. It was flagged as 47 to 67% AI written. And then I took my kids' high school papers written before 2022. So there was no generative AI. And I fed those in. And it said, yeah, these 60 to 70% of the AI written, like 0% of this. This was across 5 different tools, the top 5 tools in Google search listings. All of them wrong, all of them unpredictably wrong, and that as a set of tools, they are completely useless and they should be avoided.
And are they themselves using a foundation model? Like, where do you see, without knowing the details, or maybe without knowing the intimate details, why so bad?
Why so bad? Because in many cases, especially some of the tools that I know how they were built, they're looking for patterns. They're looking for patterns in text, but AI content is by definition going to start out average, right? These tools are really good at basically spotting people who don't prompt well when they do spot AI.
Yeah.
Who else writes average? Most average writers, right? By definition. And therefore, they're completely unreliable. Like my kids' high school papers, they're average papers. They're not great. They're not Pulitzer Prize winning. And so they use a lot of the same language and structure as the way AI would generate. In fact, AI will do a better job in many cases than my kids did. And so they're really just not fluent. The more advanced ones do try to use a language model to basically, it's like feeding a post to ChatGPT and saying, "Hey, did you write this?" And they're just not good at it.
So I think this is related to something that I keep talking about, which is what starts to happen now to the training data, now that a lot of the training data will itself have been generated by AI off the old training data, in terms of, so, I've had somebody tell me, well, it's not like making a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox. Like, okay, I'm not suggesting it's that. What I'm suggesting is that if either because of the model or because of the training data, there's some inherent bias towards some piece of information being one way or the other, does that bias get amplified over time as it sort of consumes its own training data, knowing that it's not that good at detecting if something was being written by AI today anyway? So oh, it's a post on Reddit. It was clearly written by a human, or at least my detection rate for deciding if it was written by a human is 50%. So I'm going to consume this and consume this and consume this. Like, when does Wikipedia turn into like not a trustworthy source because all the data is in a tight loop?
It was never trustworthy to begin with.
Well, it was trustworthy enough to use it as training data.
Yes.
So
Here's the
when
thing
when is it no longer trustworthy enough to use it as future training data?
Here's the thing about AI generated content being fed back to AI. It actually improves AI. It gets better. And it will for some time. And here's why. A lot of people assume if you add average data to the, machine generated average data to it, it's going to get worse. Well, that presumes that the data that's in the training data set is a normal distribution. It is not. It's a power law distribution. Most of the training data, which is public data on the internet, is crap. Right, it's that drunk Uncle Fred's Reddit shit posts, right? It's garbage, and what machines generate is mediocre. Well, so if you can start to crowd out the garbage with mediocre, what happens? The average moves up. The average improves, and so for a very long time, there will be significant improvement. In fact, Meta proved this with the Llama 3.2 models. They used Llama 3.1, the 405 billion parameter model, to create a synthetic training data set for 3.2. So they used some of their bespoke training data, aka your Facebook data, and mixed it with synthetic data made by their flagship model. What was the result? The Llama 3.2 models perform better at every task that they're given because the quality of incoming data in the training data set was better because a good chunk of it was machine made, not human made. The reality is most of the internet is garbage, and it's not very good for training on. And as a result, for a while, these tools will get better with more machine-fed data. Now, to your point about bias, yes, if there's a bias in the machines and they keep repeating it, that will increase its prevalence, the raw frequency in the training data. So hopefully AI labs that are building synthetic training data sets are taking that into account and trying to balance the data sets and manage the level of bias in them. But for the most part, in terms of raw averages, training data improves the more AI data you put back into it.
But can't be indefinitely. Like there has to be diminishing returns.
Eventually you'll hit diminishing returns. Yes, eventually you hit diminishing returns, and then it will plateau. It will not get worse. It will not collapse in on itself. It will just say, okay, I can't get significantly better. At which point, ideally, what you're starting to do, if you're a model maker, is you are getting as much bespoke data as you possibly can into it. You've licensed content from The Atlantic or the New York Times or whoever, and in doing so, you will always have some amount of good, higher quality data coming into the data set. And that, if you can train your synthesizer on that specific bespoke data, then that will get as good as humans can make.
Right. I think if I'm a writer at The Atlantic or New York Times and the generative AI is that good, I don't know that I'm writing that much human content at that point. But
exactly.
So, which is related to why this keeps coming up in, and this is the first time we've started with AI and gone back into podcasting, but I think it was a long meandering road to where we need to get to. The reason this keeps coming up is at Podcast Movement, I was shocked by the amount of FUD around AI, and not just skepticism, but like real genuine fear, or in some cases real genuine disgust. Like the way people were talking about AI, and maybe it's because as it relates to an art form, and the purity or impurity or lack thereof was a thing, but everybody was like, do we need to start using disclaimers if AI was involved in the pod? Like all this stuff that I was just like, you don't disclaim literally any other technology you use. Like disclaimer, this was edited. that would be a great disclaimer if you're going to, publish content. But of everybody's content is edited, and you sort of assume it's going to be edited. Or, before Star Wars starts, disclaimer: this was not shot in outer space. In fact, there are no droids. This was done with CGI. Don't be alarmed, people. What is it about? I mean, specifically podcasting and AI, but also not specifically. What is that fear? Is it that fear that it's going to do? You're an editor or a journalist at the Atlantic, and you might not be needed anymore.
This is humans again. So we're back in emotional territory. It's a stew of different fears. One, and this is valid, is that most AI models were built on data sets that model makers do not have permission to use. So, for example, OpenAI and its image data set scraped a gazillion images off the web. They do not have license to do that. And it is unresolved in law in the USA and will remain unresolved in law in the USA for probably another 10 years until all the court cases work themselves out, at least according to Crystal Laser at CSU's law school. As to whether or not that is a violation of intellectual property rights or not. It is unresolved in law, so it is not illegal or legal right now until we get a ruling, until we get some rulings as to whether OpenAI infringes upon people's intellectual property rights. And so that's valid. That's not a fear. That feels yucky. There is absolutely a fear, and I think a warranted fear among people who are creative, that machines will take economic opportunities away from them. And they already have been in some domains, right? And this has been going on for some time. But these tools are much more capable than previous generations. And so in free market societies, if you are a business owner, you have a profit imperative, and your profit imperative is to earn as much as you can and spend as little as you can. And if a machine can help you cut the spend side by 10%, 20%, 30%, you as a rational business person will do that if you want your business to thrive, if you are motivated by profit. If you're not motivated by profit, then you will serve whatever the imperatives are. But most businesses, including most places that hire writers and artists and videographers and photographers, are profit-oriented, and machines are seen as a viable alternative to that. There was a rather dystopian but accurate statement I saw floating around on Threads that said, AI gives wealth access to skill while denying skill access to wealth, which I thought was a good way of encapsulating some of that, because there is truth to that. It would be foolish to say that there is not some truth to that. And then, yes, there are people who are the purists who will say, well, something made by human hands is inherently better because it was made by human hands. This has been studied. MIT Sloan School of Management studied this in the fall of 2023. They did some double-blind tests: machine-generated content, human-generated but machine-edited, machine-generated but human-edited. And what they found is unlabeled AI content was preferred more by humans than human content. Labeled, meaning participants in the study were told what was generated, human and AI content performed the same. They were not, humans were given a reputation boost by other humans, but machines were not dinged for it. So the reality is, for creators in many fields, machines are competitors. Machines are competing for the work, the individual tasks. And that means that, and what's troubling about that from a macroeconomic perspective is that when you use ChatGPT or whatever to create something that you would have hired a human for instead, the economics and the dynamics of the economy change, because now you're giving money to a tech company instead of a human, and that human is not going into the regular economy and spending that money. Instead, a billionaire is, maybe getting an extra bottle of champagne or something along those lines. Where this does change things, and where the market could be going, is there's also a lot of stuff that is not taking away economic opportunity because it would never have happened to begin with. For example, I use Suno, the audio generator, a lot. I make ridiculous songs. I make songs. My friend Brooke Sellis put out a plea on LinkedIn for people to please fill out her survey that she's running. And I turned that into a song. I said, let's turn this into a pop country song. I would never have hired a human musician to do that. I would never have paid someone to do that. That song simply just would not have existed. However, it does now. And so there are roles for people to be curators of content because there's so much of it. For example, Notebook LM is a tool from Google. It's free. A lot of people have liked the audio overviews feature. In fact, a lot of people have started podcasts of purely machine generated, these two voices that are part of Google's text-to-speech library. There is a place now that podcasting is getting even more crowded for curators to say, like, here's the best human podcast to listen to. Here's the best machine-generated podcast to listen to. The more content that you have available, the more valuable curation is, because no one wants to wade through a 5 million podcast directory, right? No one wants to listen to every show. Instead, you want someone who has a point of view to curate that for you. And so there is opportunity there for creators to use their discernment skills to say, like, yeah, if you have to follow AI artists, this AI artist is the best. If you want purely human artists, this is the human artist to follow, and to be that personal recommendation engine.
I want to dive back in because I find this very interesting around the, you mentioned people being afraid of AI taking their job away. And what I'm trying to get to is, and the business owners having a profit motive requirement to do so, et cetera. I'm trying to figure out if AI is different or if this is just normal part of the cycle. But like, it's not lost on me that this person who only has a job because we had cars and electricity and the telegraph and fiber optics and microchips and mobile phones, all these other things that were going to put humans out of jobs, is worried about losing their job because there's a new technology coming. Like, is that not just the cycle of every time there's a new tool, something happens where, like, literally everybody whose job could be replaced is a job that in 1979 people would say, oh my God, this person's unemployable because the microchip's going to do their job for them now. Like, how is AI different than the microchip is fundamentally my question as it comes to that fear of displacement. Or is it not different and it's just we're in the bottom of the first or the top of the second, and that's what happens when you're at the bottom of the first or the top of the second?
This is not new. I'll give you a really good example. One I use in my keynote addresses when I give this talk. One human being, you or me, probably not me because I'm terrible at it, can harvest a bushel of corn in about 10 hours, right? It would take me 20. That same one human can drive a John Deere X9 1100 industrial combine and harvest 23,000 bushels in the same 10 hours. And so what happens? Farming gets way more efficient. Agriculture used to be 70% of our economy. It is now, in terms of the number of humans working in it, less than 1%. A lot of the other humans went first into manufacturing and then into services. Or if you look at the history of labor of the last 200 years, we're not producing less food, right? We're producing more food than ever, but we have mechanization that automates so much of it. What you're seeing now is the same thing happening in knowledge work, where people who thought their jobs were insulated from the way machines can make you more efficient are suddenly realizing, yeah, that instead of needing 1,000 writers on staff, you can have one plus industrial machinery to create the same level of output. And there are a lot of writers who will say correctly that, the content produced by machines is not super high quality. It's not Pulitzer Prize winning. It's not, and they're correct. However, if you look at things like most corporate marketing copy, it ain't Pulitzer Prize winning either. It's one step above slop. And as a result, machines can do that work and will do that work because it's not very good to begin with. And so you're seeing a sector now react to mechanization in the same way that, but what's different about it now as opposed to in agriculture is agriculture, the change happened over generations. It happened over 150 years. So you farmed one way, your kids farmed another way. And if it stayed within the family, your grandkids farmed a totally different way. No one lost their jobs because it was generations happening. Maybe your great grandkids didn't even go into farming, right? Maybe they went to work in the factories, whatever. AI is happening on a ridiculously compressed time scale where suddenly you who was in your 30s or your 20s, doing a craft, now in your in your late 20s, you're like, holy crap, by the time I'm 35, I might not have work because the mechanization is happening so fast. It's not happening generationally. It is just happening really, really fast. And so there's a much greater chance of a large-scale economic dislocation because of the speed at which it's happening, as opposed to it being much more gradual. Humans are bad at rapid change. Humans are
Right.
very good at gradual change. That's one of the reasons why, for example, climate change is such a problem, because it was gradual and suddenly it's not. And we're all like, what happened? And they're like, well, this thing that's been happening for the last 100 years is suddenly you're having multiplicative impacts. And all the different models that were forecasting what was likely to happen were additive models. And as a result, you're seeing this multiplicative effect, like, oh, things are happening way faster than we thought. It's that the old, it happens very slowly and then all at once. And that's kind of what's happening now.
Yeah, and the other adage, right? Revolutions don't happen because of poor conditions; they happen because of conditions rapidly changing.
Yes.
And yes, it's that reaction. I can see that difference with AI, but I guess it is faster than the microchip. But and on a sector basis, of course, over time they were all affected. But I think what I would say is, I would still bet that the 25-year graph of the U.S. unemployment rate looks the same as it did for the previous 25 years and the 25 years before that and the 25 years before that.
Unemployment, yes. Median household income, no. Median household income marched with productivity up until the 1970s. And then once you get into the late 70s, early 80s, it totally diverged. Productivity went way up. Corporate profitability stayed going way up. And household income flatlined.
Right. But GDP went up. So that's the question of where did the GDP go, which is your point, right? It's an extra bottle of champagne for the billionaire.
Exactly. Exactly. And so one of the things that as industries we're going to have to figure out is, are there models of companies, and there are, but are there models of companies that can operate successfully but be nonprofit initiatives? So a newspaper that is a stated nonprofit company where the money that it makes is mainly to pay the salaries of the people who work there, as opposed to a for-profit initiative where the goal is very different. So the nonprofit structure may be one of the ways to continue finding employment for people if other human beings are willing to invest in those things. Like, so if you started a nonprofit newspaper, call it the Washington Nonprofit Post or something like that, owned by zero billionaires, would people buy it? And would they buy it at a scale enough to support the company's existence as a nonprofit enterprise?
Right. Well, the thing is, if enough people buy it, it doesn't need to be a nonprofit. If enough people buy it, then it only needs to be a nonprofit if enough people don't buy it. And you okay.
The structure would be the initiative about what you do with the profits. That's what really defines a nonprofit, is what you do with the profits. So you might say, this company exists as a nonprofit specifically to pay a competitive living wage for, this profession.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting because the question becomes, where does that money come from? Because it's hard for that thing to compete in the capital market. So it becomes something that needs benefactors, either in the form of a government or a something else that looks much more charitable than Something
Right.
mission driven might be the right phrase as opposed to profit driven. Today, we're talking about future problems, right? And the challenge
No, these
is
are
that
today problems because
they
we need
might
to
be
solve them
coming a
today.
lot. They might be coming down the pike a lot sooner than we think. Um, what should people who are concerned about that be doing? So if you're somebody who's either concerned for humanities jobs on a sector by sector basis, or for your own job in 2024, what does one do other than sit there and be fearful?
At the individual level, you have to figure out how much risk exposure you have to artificial intelligence, and then ideally be one of the people who is skilled at it, so that you are less disposable than your peers. Right? If you can do your job and you can administer the AI doing your job, you by definition have employment, because you'll be the person who runs the machines. And the other people who do not have that skill set will not be employed. That's your remit as an individual. As a member of a collective, whether it's a country or a municipality or whatever, something that free market economies had better figure out real soon is something like universal basic income, right? The GDP in most developed nations would support at least a partial universal basic income scheme of some kind that allows people to meet their basic living needs. There is enough. I mean, here's the thing. Ever since the Bretton Woods Accord in 1971 under the Nixon administration, where we left the metal standards behind, all money has been fictional. Right? All money is, you heard this a lot into the crypto era when people were talking about, fiat currency and how crypto was the next iteration of money. And it turned out to mostly not be true. However, their point about all money being fictional is correct. Fiat currency is fictional. It is based on faith. It is the only faith-based thing we have. Money has value because we believe it has value. The government can print it at will, and obviously, as long as you continue to have faith in it, it works. When you have things like hyperinflation is when you stop having a faith in it, because you get all these really distorted economic effects from it. So in a situation where if you wanted to deploy something like universal basic income, you absolutely could, because the money exists. It's just not evenly distributed, or not more evenly distributed. Just like you could solve, for example, housing as an issue relatively quickly, right? Building a bunch of houses is not a complicated endeavor. The same amount of money it would take to build, 10 million houses is like what 5 F-35 planes cost. It's where you allocate those resources and the side effects of that. In most free market economies in the USA, there is a strong financial benefit to having homelessness, which sounds like a horrifying thing, but it's true, because house values not only help the real estate profession, they help people who are homeowners. The property values appreciate, but then also many municipalities are financed based on real estate taxes. So if you suddenly create a whole bunch of new real estate, you deplete the housing value, and then you can collect much fewer taxes from any individual home. And so there's these very strong economic incentives in a system to encourage homelessness, which is kind of perverse when you think about it. So all of this to say, in terms of what we should be thinking about as a society and as a civilization, as a species, we have all the resources we need to solve these problems. What we lack is the collective will to do something about it. You do see this in some places on Earth. So the Scandinavian countries, for example, have very, very high taxes, particularly for corporations. Corporations have extremely high taxes there. However, because of that, they collect taxes at something like 3x the rate for corporations of America. They have that much more revenue to push back into infrastructure and investment in individual citizens and things. And as a result, they have a pretty good standard of living. If you look at the annual best places to live on Earth charts, it's usually those countries, because they fund that with tax income. By the same token, you will never see that at least in the USA, because no corporation is going to say, yeah, let's triple our tax rate. That sounds good.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of that is related to what you said in the first place, which is people's reaction to change, specifically quickly, which is um, people don't like giving up what they already have. As a outside observer to most U.S. politics, because I'm Canadian, there's so many things that I see people would not choose for themselves if they had a blank slate, but they choose to cling to because it's what they have. So specifically around healthcare, like nobody would take the U.S. healthcare system as it is today and deploy it to a new place as a model. And I saw a poll to that effect. This was probably 15, 20 years ago now. It was, I think the poll capitalized on some world-renowned poor geography skills from America, because they made up a country. Yes. They were like, the Republic of New Nairobi, just got their freedom from Britain, and they're setting up a new country. Do you think they should, A, have access to universal healthcare, B, have no access to healthcare, C, have healthcare tied to their employer, who then has to pay taxes, and if they lose their jobs, they only get healthcare for 60 days, and then the new employer has to, an insurance basis. Oh, nobody chose that the folks in New Nairobi, should get, the current system. Nobody would want that upon a society. At the same time, you pull that exact same group of people, and you're like, hey, we're thinking about moving to universal, healthcare. How do you feel about it? It's no, you can't take what I have. I know how that works. I don't want the new thing that I don't know how it works. Or even the more controversial version of that, as a not American, is like the Second Amendment. Like, if America didn't have guns today, no outside observer would be like, we should introduce, let's give everybody guns. Nobody would reasonably inject that into a society, but at the same time, you can't take them away now. And so there's a lot of that.
Yeah, Rory Sutherland talked about this in one of his TED Talks, which I thought was excellent. In most societies, when you get a speeding ticket, you get points on your license. And he said in Italy, they what they figure out is loss aversion is a much greater motivator. So you start with 20 points and you lose points with every ticket, and people are like, oh no, I lost a point. I don't want to do that again. And it is that interesting twist of psychology about how our brains work, where that loss aversion means more to us than the other.
Yes, I've seen I think it's Chris Voss, in one of the Black Swan slides. It's like a seesaw, and it's like opportunity, loss aversion, and the loss aversion side is like, the opportunity is stacked this high, and the loss aversion is like this big, and it's like, oh no, that's definitely what I'm going to favor. So yeah, it's but net, I think that's why it would be hard for an existing country, let's say, to dramatically make changes to the tax rate, let's say. But to your point about farmers, you could Scandinavia could start to lower theirs, but if they lowered it to a 4% corporate rate tomorrow, everybody would go insane. Right? Like, they'd have to ratchet it down slowly, and any other economy would need to ratchet it up slowly. But I think there's, I think on a 100-year timescale, there's opportunities for every economy to get smarter, better.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the reason that many of Europe's economies and countries function pretty well, and I talk about this like operating systems. The USA's operating system is roughly 230 some years old. It's basically still running MS-DOS, right? Europe went through 2 world wars, many of which flattened most of the nations and completely disrupted those countries. And so a lot of them have very new constitutions, and they have very new governance by comparison. They're like running Windows 98. And as a result, they function a little bit better because they've rebooted, and things are different. Now, the obvious downside of that is, those changes came at incredibly high human costs, right? Millions and millions and millions of people dead. that seems to be humanity's way of doing things. We are not a particularly smart species in that in that aspect.
It's funny you say that. I think Eric Weinstein has said that. He's like, there's been like way too long a period of peace in North America for really any change to happen, because there hasn't been a catalyst, to your point, that drives change. Is like peacetime change is hard.
Yes.
And that's not to say that the answer to making change is war. It's just it's a real thing, and we just haven't had it in a while. On this side of the Atlantic, and when you don't have it for a while, it is very easy to get nice and comfy, and think that actually, my marginal tax rate going up, a quarter point or 5%. This is like the crisis of our times. And it's really not, right? It's certainly even the AI conversation gets a lot stranger if you have to account for a high attrition rate of your able-bodied men and women ages 18 to 28. So like there's a lot of impact in a lot of ways that peacetime makes certain generations approach differently than previous generations. Although I think I've reached the point of like, this is so far outside my area of anything of expertise. I'm going to try and steer it back. Not that it's not interesting, but I'm going to try and steer it back to the technology side. I don't want to go into how you could apply, how all this gets applied to the military, because I think that's also very interesting. But from a practical standpoint, your practical implementations of AI specifically that you referenced were around, classification AI, marketing data, sort of huge big data sets, not unlike trying to figure out, global politics, let's say. This is something that has been on my mind since 1999, and maybe you have the answer, or maybe the AI tool that can have the answer. My theory was that nobody ever really understood advertising on the internet. And the day that I, probably because of the human element, because it's just so easy to start getting people to do things and measure the things they do. My theory always was, and this was late 90s, maybe the year 2000, we were selling ads, and I went, nobody gets advertising on the internet, because if they understood advertising on the internet from the hours of 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., I would just see pictures of a nice steaming Big Mac everywhere, and I couldn't click it. I couldn't fill out a survey to get a code. There'd be nothing. It would just be like Big Mac following me everywhere, like a billboard or a drive time radio ad. And it would just be there, reminding me all the time that, you're a male aged 18 to 35 and it's lunchtime, and you should probably go eat something that looks this delicious. And that's it. And because I always felt like that was where all the traditional big marketing spend went, right? Nobody went like, oh, we're going to put an ad on TV for a Swiffer, and the way we're going to know it's successful is if within 30 seconds people go buy a Swiffer. Today, that's like online advertising, it feels like. It's like, oh my God, they didn't click. We gave them a call to action. They didn't action. What an utter failure of marketing. Are we at the point now where we could support marketers in buying a online ad that asks the viewer to do nothing? Or is that...
You can do that as long as you have a solid measurement plan for it. And the measurement plan is going to be expensive. It is going to be among your targeted audience, running opinion surveys and things to say like, what is the likelihood you're going to purchase a Big Mac in the next 7 days? And that continuous level of surveying, you measure the delta in that. So when you deploy the non-clickable image ad within a defined period of time, again, this goes back to the uplift modeling we were talking about at the very start of this. You can see either there is or there's not a delta in the change based on a campaign. You run it for a period of time. You don't stop everything else. So obviously, you continue doing it else, but then you can test that. One of the silver linings of a very dark cloud that was the pandemic was that in 2020, a lot of our data sets came to a halt as the world shut down for about 3 months, give or take. And that data is still, if companies have any sense, they have secured that data and put it in a vault somewhere, because that is the real world A/B test that you could never conduct. What happens when you turn everything off, right? We saw that environmentally, like, saw the canals of Venice had dolphins in them, and you could see the bottom because there was no human activity. But also so many things commercially and in marketing, marketers were like, what do we do? Like, we can't run ads because our place of business is physically closed. That data is valuable. That data is incredibly valuable, and it is for most people, it is now in the rear view, and they have forgotten that it exists. But you can go back and study that data and say, well, what does it look like when the customer stops? Brands like Coca-Cola realized, that, what? The brand is still incredibly powerful, and people still go to the grocery store, so people can still buy our product. Other companies, they ran into some severe issues because their place of business was not open.
Yeah, and I mean, my recollection of the initial somewhat shutdown that happened everywhere was anybody that was brick and mortar was just like, there's nothing for me to do. I'm not built to move fast enough,
right,
to handle this.
Yeah. Most companies went through a 10-year digital transformation in 2 months.
Yeah. We did the opposite. We became a logistics company. Like, we were a technology company, and then it was like, okay, we just need to deploy more servers. Oh, what do you mean they stopped making servers in China for 3 months? Oh, okay, well, we'll just get them here. What do you mean UPS and FedEx can't guarantee that they can move something from A to B anymore? Oh, okay, well, what do you mean once we get it there, we can't go in and rack it and plug it in? On the technology side, there's so much cloud today that people are disconnected from what happens sort of one level underneath that, of like, Amazon had a nice advantage that they owned their own data centers and they could let their own employees in to rack their own servers. And that was not a crime against any municipal, local code that had been passed temporarily, as opposed to if you were in somebody else's data center, it was perhaps illegal to go inside and rack a server. So even the underpinnings of the technology transformations were challenging, just because there were things aligning. Like, we hit the supply chain gap from China, then we had the logistics problems that UPS and FedEx were happening. Like, it was hard to make things digital for a while, I guess is what I would say.
Yep.
The intersection between AI, marketing, that big data set, to me, that's the most interesting, because that's the one that has the most human biases in it. Just sort of what I was alluding to with my, like, how come I can't see, pictures of a Big Mac? And it's like, it's not because anybody thinks it's ineffective. It's because people are afraid of losing their jobs if they can't show that it is effective, which is not the same thing. Are there other areas where that is a huge uplift? Like, my brain is going to things like, actuarial tables for insurance companies and things like that, where there's, in theory, that should be a vocation that has no biases and is the most, like, data-driven thing. But I would have to imagine that's an area where AI is. Yeah.
Insurance is the profession that invented redlining. Right?
Yeah.
No, every profession that has humans working in it has human biases in it. That's just the nature of the beast, quite literally. And we have to be cautious in our use of artificial intelligence to recognize our own human biases in these things, and then to do our best to mitigate them. You can never get rid of them, but you can at least be conscious of them and mitigate them to some degree. But the first step, as always, is admitting you have a problem.
Well, I think I've said this before somewhere, but like that was one of the things that struck out to me actually during COVID, to use that timeline. Is I was traveling a lot across the border, and one of the things that happened when you came back to Canada at the time is you could be randomly selected to have to do a PCR test at the airport instead of at home. And random selection looked an awful lot like, here's your sticker.
Mhm.
And at the time I was like, this is not like, this is fine. I'm not saying this is a bad idea, but like, don't call this random selection. This is the opposite of random selection. This is you staring at somebody and deciding if you want to give them a sticker or not. Like random selection would be, here's a coin. If you flip it and it lands heads, you go that way. If you flip it and it lands tails, you go that way. But you just having X number of stickers to hand out every day and deciding who they're going to go to is not random. And I feel like that definition of random is also starting. There's a danger of AI there, right? If people like AI has, the technology has randomly selected you for a secondary here. And again, it's like, well, it wasn't random. It was trained to look at me and go, you should give that guy a secondary. Is that something from an ethical standpoint? Is that something as AI consumers that we have to be doing something about, or today is that something that is a governance issue for the people building the models?
Yes to all of the above. Ethics is part and parcel of the deployment of AI. So, but I do thank you for having me on the show. And if you'd like to find me, you can find me at TrustInsights.ai.
Awesome, Christopher. Thanks so much. Appreciate your time.
Have a great day.
You too.
This is different, another round, so much more to talk about. Gonna aim to satisfy with help from CacheFly. Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast. The Anycast podcast, brought to you by CacheFly.